Splatoon Raiders has been out for a little over a week now, and yours truly has spent that time playing through it cover to cover. Don't worry though, as you've no doubt guessed by this title, this is a spoiler-free review, so rest assured, no plot details will be given away. With that out of the way, let's talk about the game itself. First and foremost, despite the marketing, Splatoon Raiders is a cooperative multiplayer game, much akin to something like Borderlands or Monster Hunter, that can be enjoyed entirely solo. I can only imagine the marketing team pushed this as a single-player only game to ensure nobody went into this thinking it was going to fulfill the role of being a proper fourth mainline entry, much like how Splatoon 3 sort of replaced Splatoon 2 for lack of better wording. After the first 30 minutes or so, you're able to play the entire thing in a group of 4 if you so choose. Enemies and loot will scale with each additional player added, and because the game has RPG elements to it, that isn't to say you'll be unable to participate organically if levels between players are too steep. The game scales things so smartly between your group that you don't feel like you're either a glass cannon or invincible the entire time. That's not to say it's impossible to achieve that effect, of course, but that's really hard to do when you're playing in a group. Moreover, the game keeps players close together if somebody is behind in terms of progression. Say a couple of folks in your group are roughly in the mid to late game areas, but a friend of yours is still in the early game portions. Progress will be tied to the player furthest back, meaning everyone else will have to go back and help clear certain stages to help that person behind catch up. Not every stage is required, and in most cases, it's usually just the final level to an area that you have to beat, which only takes a couple of minutes to get through. I could see how someone might get annoyed by this, but the safeguards that Splatoon Raiders has, the more I played, the more I began to realize just how many headaches they managed to prevent. For instance, there's a type of stage that involves the group exploring an open area, and you need to reach crystals across the map, mowing down waves of enemies around that crystal before you can break them. You go around the map, knocking them out within a certain threshold, before you're finally able to go back and break the giant one at the beginning. While these maps aren't the biggest, at first I grumbled about them since they don't allow players to divide and conquer the area and get it done quickly. However, considering the perspective, I'm sure you've had at least once in your life, even if it's secondhand. A group of friends have someone playing a new game with them that they're unfamiliar with and maybe not as passionate about. The game puts all of them in a large area, and working together is key. That person in the group who doesn't know where they are, they don't really know what they're doing, and they wind up lost or stuck somewhere. As a result, the group isn't able to play effectively. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but you get the idea. In Splatoon Raiders, the group is bound to the host in these stages. There's an invisible radius keeping the group tethered to one another, and anyone who's not the host, you have the option to warp to the host in no time at all. This keeps the stages artificially paced, sure, however at the same time, it prevents the group from spending a little too long wandering around aimlessly. There's a couple smaller things like this in place, but that's the big one that stands out to me. On the topic of stages, you have a nice variety that you rotate between in order to keep things fresh, no pun intended. First, you have the traditional pseudo-platforming stages, like any Splatoon campaign you've played before, where you make your way to the end of a given stage while splatting enemies along the way. You have the previously mentioned open area stages in which you find crystals across the map and take out the surrounding enemies, an arena stage in which you run through multiple floors of enemies charging at you as you collect eggs under a time limit, much like Salmon Run, and then there's puzzle stages, meant to get you used to handling the various gadgets that you can make your loadout around. That's all of course ignoring boss fights, which there aren't many. However, much like the rest of the game, each stage has 3 difficulty levels. You're free to do each difficulty as soon as you're able, and the rewards range from material currency to even compasses, which I'll get into those later. The only thing that truly makes these stages harder is the jump in level values. Normal difficulty could be say 35, hard for that same level could be 50, meanwhile very hard could be like 75. I wouldn't let any of those numbers intimidate you, because there does come a point where the levels really don't matter much anymore as long as you're doing basically everything along the way. If you do attempt the hardest stages the moment you have access to them, you're bound to get slapped around pretty hard. But otherwise, once you get to the postgame, despite being 20 levels below the recommended threshold myself, for a lot of these I really didn't find myself with many issues. But back on the note of the builds and gadgets. You have 3 classes that you can freely swap between at a time: speed, power, and tactics. Each one has their own unique skills and abilities that you can equip, as well as their corresponding gadgets, which function as your secondaries throughout the game. Later on, you'll be able to mix and match these to an extent, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The usage of these are all decent, however, I did find myself ignoring a handful of them for majority of the game. Speed gadgets typically enable you to get some distance to or from enemies while knocking them around upon impact. I used these mostly in the early game and then moved on. Next, you have power, which is more self-explanatory. These gadgets typically let you charge up a strong hit and do significant damage upon impact at the cost of being rather slow to pull off. Some of these take more of an area of effect approach, which I got a lot more use out of. But any that required me to have good timing or precise aim, I didn't use any longer than I needed to. Lastly is my favorite, tactics. These are primarily your idle and area of effect type of attack that rely primarily on your placement and maneuverability. I spent majority of the game with these, but did switch off of them for one or two instances. These gadgets include turrets, lasers that dart out in multiple directions and then stay put like an electric wire, and beams that attach themselves to you and leave behind a trail that any enemy chasing you collectively takes damage from. I feel as though usage of these gadgets can vary, however, I believe it comes down to how different players may think when in combat. I could see someone using all of these, but much like how I previously stated, perhaps not seeing the others as worthwhile alternatives. It is worth pointing out that none of this is tied to the weapon types. So long as you have a weapon of that type, like splatter shots, buckets, rollers, and so forth, you can freely switch between them at any point that you so choose. They'll receive perks in a similar fashion to mainline Splatoon games, where a weapon could have upwards of 3 perks. The weapons themselves have a ranking of 1 to 5 stars. Once you start getting closer to the endgame, you'll begin to have mostly 4 to 5 star weapons. But for all intents and purposes, you're really not going to be trying to enhance perks or rotate them out until post-game, and even then, you're only using 5-star weapons by that point. Now, unlike mainline Splatoon games, instead of having to grind matches to get EXP, this time around you can break down your unwanted weapons and receive in-game currency, and any perks that were attached to those weapons that you're scrapping will be deposited into a separate bank. When you have enough of a certain perk in your scrap collection, you can then use those scraps to upgrade that perk on a different weapon of your choice. The game does tell you a bit later on that anything you scrapped previously is being quietly held onto for your convenience, so don't be afraid to scrap anything prior to being told this. Separately from your weapon, there's also perks that can be given to your build. These can be upgraded over the course of the game as you collect treasures throughout. At first, you'll only be able to equip a couple, but as the game goes on, you'll be able to have many more in your arsenal. You can mostly mix and match these as much as you want, however, there are some restrictions depending on what tank you're using. Tactics, for instance, can't use speed perks, power can't use tactics perks, and speed can't use power. Now, to quickly address the compasses, these things are collectibles that unlock your puzzle stages. There's a handful of these in the game, and each one gives you about 1 to 3 skill points upon completion, which you can give yourself permanent buffs with. The only nitpick I have with these is that once you get a compass, you then have to find it on the island map using the compass itself as your guide. Majority of these are straightforward and simplistic. However, near the endgame, I found myself getting annoyed as you begin to get these blue ones that only react if you're hitting the correct directional input on the controller, not the correct area on the map like every other up to that point. It's not hard, it just comes off a little tedious. As I got to the last couple, I finally just glanced at a guide and sent a screenshot of my map completed to my friends, who I knew everyone was going to be playing with, so we could all start post-game together on the same footing. Lastly, and the reason this review took so long to come out, was because of the post-game. If you're the type that considers knowing about post-game to be a spoiler in of itself, I would recommend turning away now. You have been warned. So, at first you're given 3 mini-dungeons to run through in order to get treasure parts. Beat them once with each tank, and the treasure for that mini-dungeon is now yours. Once you have all of those, you can then enter the bottomless buffet. This is a 100-floor gauntlet of you and your friends in tight arenas to defeat an onslaught of enemies and grab eggs before the time runs out. The bottomless buffet is broken up into 34 stages, with the exception of the finale. Each level is broken up into increments of 3 floors each. Depending on your reflexes, you should be able to get through most of these by yourself, no problem, up until you reach the 90s. I easily spent a good 6 to 8 hours trying to get through them alone since the level gap had finally caught up to me. I needed to go back and grind a bit, which is the first and only time in the entire game I truly felt like I was outright grinding. I assumed the idea was, by this point, you would be going back and replaying stages with your friends, since just like in the main story, if anyone in the group is behind, you have to go back and catch them up before you can progress, so to speak. Ultimately, it's a well-rounded challenge that I feel is what keeps the game from feeling too short. After the initial 100 stages to truly conclude the story, then you have an endless mode of sorts. Not endless as in go until you fail, but instead, a 3-floor dungeon that begins to be randomly generated from that point onward so you and your friends can easily jump back in and keep playing without a definitive stopping point. Unless the game really clicked with you, I can't see much point in continuing onwards after this. However, I'm glad it's there should the mood strike my friends who need to go back in and get our Splatoon fix without dealing with the timed content like in the mainline game so far. And with that, we have covered everything I felt was worth mentioning for this review, so with everything said and done, I give Splatoon Raiders a 9 out of 10. Maybe if I was playing this entire game by myself, I'd have gone a little bit lower, but the fact I was able to spend majority of my playtime getting a group together and have fun for hours into the night really boosted it. For the first spin-off game for the Splatoon series, the team absolutely crushed it. Give it a try if you're even mildly curious about it. As always, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Till then, everybody.